probably okay like this, I think. So I'm pretty much just going to call this done. But there's a lot of things I think that sort of impeded this from being a really decent paint job. For such a large figure, I mean, this is a 3-inch figure. A lot of the detail got obscured to the point where it really felt like I was painting like a really old lead model from the early part of the century. And the reason I say that is the original model that I downloaded was meant to be printed out around 7 or 8 inches tall, maybe even a little taller than that. And frankly, that was way too big, and it was going to take way too many hours for me to print out. I just wanted to do a couple of test prints, which is really what these were. These were just some very simple test prints. I just wanted to kind of get out of the way and just, see how the printer worked. But, I mean, it's cool. It's Mandalorian, right? So I figured, well, let's try printing them a little smaller. So I reduced the scale to about 3 inches. It took it roughly about half the size. Maybe even a third of the size it was originally designed to be. And that's where I ran into problems. And I'm going to go into a little detail about why that is here in a second. As soon as I'm done with this little guy. So let me explain what the problem is with these. All right, so not really a good way to do this with a real thin pen and get it to show up on camera, so I'm going to use a Sharpie. So here's the problem. If you've got a print that was originally designed to be, let's say, 10 inches tall, and we're gonna use this helmet shape as an example. Let's say this represents that 10-inch tall helmet, right? Here's our Mandalorian helmet. Okay. And then we reduce this down to roughly this big. That's more or less what I did. Right? So what happens is, when these are being laid out on the printer, you're drawing out very thin lines, and you're layering these lines on top of each other. And when they're really big like this, you're not really going to notice those lines so much, right? I mean, this is probably, we're talking like super thin lines, like. And what happens is you get this at this scale, you'll end up getting a fairly smooth looking helmet. You're not going to notice a lot of issues. A lot of the details are very, very small, but because you're doing it in such a large scale with such thin lines, these details don't get lost. Now, that's if your line is, like, say, as thick as this. Now, when you reduce this down, let's take this little scope thing that, like, say, Boba Fett has on his helmet. If this scope thing is barely 2 of these lines thick, and then I have to translate that over to the smaller scale, and that's barely 1 line thick to keep the scale, accurate. What's going to happen is one of 2 things. It's either going to print something that's extremely frail because this raised object, which is usually shaped like this, is actually printing line by line. See? So at this scale, you're going to see the little bitty lines inside this. But at this scale, it's too small. It would literally be dots on top of each other. and the printer just isn't going to be able to handle that. Same thing goes for smaller details. Like if I had a small vent detail on this thing, like say there's a little detail like this on the helmet, and then I wanted to put it on this side. It's so small that that detail just gets lost because the lines you're using are just too thick. So what happens is a lot of that detail just gets obscured. On top of that, these thin lines that made the helmet look so smooth and shiny before now look like gigantic ridges. So you're not going to get that same smooth curvature. And you'll see that. I mean, I painted it as well as I could to kind of get away from that, but you'll still see that to some degree in this one. And if I get it right there, see those lines? You've got all those concentric circles across the top of his head. On this larger size, you probably wouldn't even notice that. And you'll see a lot of those lines here again in the cape, on the shoulders, and a lot of other areas. It's not quite as noticeable in some spots. It's more noticeable in others, mostly in the curved areas. Again, some of these tiny little details like the buckle, there was more detail in this figure, I guarantee you, when it was at 3 times the size. But a lot of that detail get lost. Again, you've got these small lines on the back of the helmet. I don't know if we can focus in on that. See that? These little ridges. Those are supposed to be there. They're not lines that are scanned in, but the lines are so thin, you can see what size line I'm talking about. On a bigger figure, this would be a lot more interesting looking, or at least more detailed. Same thing goes for the pistol. There's a lot of little details in that pistol that, you know, I mean, yeah, I could have made up for it with the paint job. Like I said, I didn't really want to go too far into it. But yeah, they get lost. So that's what happens. And I think in particular, this one, a lot of the details kind of get lost. You'll see that kind of, again, that sort of ridges. And if you ever look at one of these helmets online, you'll see that what I'm talking about, what exactly that detail is. But again, look at that. See the circles on top, all the little lines? It's like a topographical map, which to me, I mean, you know, that's kind of cool. But again, since it's a smaller scale, you'll lose a lot of those little tiny details that would normally be in a figure this size. If I were to have sculpted this, I could have done a lot cleaner, smoother, and more detailed finish on the model, and painting it would have been a lot easier. I found myself kind of filling in the gaps, you know, like, well, I think that might be something. I'll just paint over it and see what happens. But yeah, and you can see a lot of the ridges in there. And that's just something that's going to happen. It's a part of 3D printing. One way you can try to avoid that is if you have a nozzle, all these nozzles on the 3D printers are threaded. And if you look at them, let's say from this point of view, looking up at where the extruder actually spills out the stuff, they're going to have different size holes. And these different size holes are going to determine how thin these very small lines are. You can do some of that in the settings for the print or settings for your printer in the slicer like Cura or Lychee Slicer. And if you're not familiar with that, I highly recommend looking it up. This isn't going to be a very detailed how to 3D print video, but I just wanted to kind of cover some of the things, you know, some of the issues I ran into when I was painting these and why they probably could have been a little bit better than they are. I mean, they're okay. I mean, they're, you know, for just having them sit on, I mean, you can tell what it is, right? You can tell what these are supposed to be at least. So if I've just got them sitting on a counter, you know, nobody's going to really pay too much attention. Oh, yeah, look at that. It's that Mandalorian guy. Yeah, sure is. He looks a little funny, though. Yeah, something's kind of funny about that detail. You know where I'm going with that. Anyway, so the point is, if you do decide to print something out to paint and you're not using a resin printer, which, you know, of course, resin printers they avoid all of this. But if you got an FDM printer and you're doing something really large, you know, something that's got a lot of detail, like a circuit board or some other little thing that's got details like this, just keep in mind that when you reduce that down, oops, there you go. When you reduce this down, suddenly these are going to be a lot harder. I mean, it's basically like what I'm doing with a Sharpie. If I were drawing this with a super thin pencil, no problem. But since I've got a thick Sharpie, harder to get those details in there, right? And that's my point. So just, kind of take that into consideration whenever you're printing something and then reducing the scale. And then think about when you're going to paint it, if you decide to paint it. But even if you don't, you're going to notice. You're going to notice that there's a lot more. The scan lines or the print lines are going to be a lot more obvious when you get to a smaller scale. On something really large, it's not going to matter. And that's why I think a lot of people, if you're printing something really large, I think I did mine on a 0.4. They usually will go with like a 0.6 or even a 0.8 size. In other words, a larger hole, diameter hole, which means it's extruding much thicker lines. If you're doing something really large, or you're just using something that's not going to need to have a lot of detail, like a mechanical piece or a piece for a shelf or a wheel that you're going to use on a toy, not a model, for just getting the stuff done fast. That's the other thing. This prints a lot faster when it's printing thicker. You're going to use probably like a 0.6. 0.4 and below, you get much thinner lines that print with a lot more detail. If I were to print this with a nozzle that had an even thinner, tinier hole, I guarantee you it'd probably look a little cleaner. But it would also probably take me twice as long to print. These both printed in about 3 hours, 3.5 hours for the pair. The original one was going to take something along the lines of 9 or 12 hours. So yeah, I didn't want to do that. So I printed them small. They're manageable, 3 inches, and did I lose some detail? Yeah, but did they come out okay? I mean, arguably, yeah, I think they did. I think they turned out all right. So again, just something to consider if you ever decide to do this. As far as the paintability of the PLA that I used, it was good. I liked it. It holds the paint really well. I did put a spray paint primer. I mean, the spray paint rattle can primer didn't really do anything to it. And I think in general, I had a fun time painting them. So, just something to think about. Thanks for subscribing. And same thing with the Thwomp. I mean, you probably saw that. But yeah, thanks for subscribing. If you haven't already subscribed, please do. And like the video if you found it interesting or useful. And I will catch you in the next one. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.